Imagine that you are an Afghan soldier in the 18th century, one part of a larger force that is trying to invade the Punjab region of India, and after a long day's march, you are placed on guard duty for the first night shift, and you stand near the edge of the tree line, trying your best to stay awake 3 hours into your night shift. It is pitch black, completely silent, and nothing is moving. And then suddenly, the soldier standing right next to you drops to his knees. You look over, confused. He didn't make a sound, he just dropped straight to the ground. And in the moonlight, you can barely make out that his throat has been cleanly sliced open. You panic and look around. You didn't hear a gunshot. You didn't hear the snap of a bowstring. And there is no one nearby. And then you see it lying in the dirt embedded in the ground next to your dying friend. A solid steel ring, dripping with blood. And you have never seen anything like it before in your life. And today, we are talking about a weapon that defies gravity. A weapon that is completely silent, virtually invisible in the dark, and capable of decapitating a man from 60 yards away. And this hard to believe it's a real weapon is called the Chakram. And it breaks every single rule of how a projectile weapon is supposed to work. But before we begin, don't forget, if you want to find out more about weapons, wars, and warriors from Indian history, then subscribe to my channel, Lethal History. Now think about a normal missile weapon, a spear, a rock, or even a throwing knife. When you throw it, gravity immediately takes over. It travels in an arc, loses momentum, and eventually falls to the ground. But that logic simply does not apply to a Chakram. And that's because the Chakram doesn't just go up and then fall. It actually flies through the air to a degree. And that's because hundreds of years before airplanes were invented, blacksmiths in the Indian subcontinent figured out the aerodynamics of an airfoil wing. They forged the top of the Chakram to be curved and the bottom to be perfectly flat. And when you spin a Chakram at high speeds, this shape allows the weapon to actually generate lift. It cuts through the air, resisting gravity, flying flatter and further than any blade has the right to. And to make this aerodynamic nightmare weapon a reality, ancient forges used something called wootz steel, which is the same legendary metal contained within the world-renowned and legendary Damascus swords. This metal was heated to nearly 2000 degrees and hammered into a perfect circle, which is nothing special in itself. But here is where the secret to the Chakram comes in, because blacksmiths would then only sharpen the outside of the ring, and the outer edge was ground down until it was razor sharp, but the inside edge was left completely blunt. And that blunt inner edge was crucial because of how this weapon was thrown. You didn't hold it like a frisbee and just throw it. You threaded your bare index finger through the center of the ring, and a warrior would spin the Chakram on his finger until it reached a blinding speed of 20 revolutions per second, generating massive gyroscopic stability. Then, with a violent flick of the wrist, the Chakram would be released, hitting any target it comes into contact with, razor-sharp deadliness. But of course, handling a weapon that was sharp on all edges was difficult, and training with the Chakram was a bloody and terrifying process. And that's because if the blacksmith made a ring that was even slightly unbalanced, or if the warrior released it at the wrong angle, the blade wouldn't fly straight. No, it would wobble, violently snap off the index finger, and slash backward directly into the thrower's own forearm or face. And it would take a brave and courageous warrior to even attempt to wield a weapon as fierce as the Chakram. And there are no warriors more renowned for their deadliness with the Chakram and their mastery of this weapon than the Sikh warriors known as the Akali Nihangs, which were the fierce, elite shock troopers of the Sikh Empire during the 19th century. And in large battles, the Nihangs would line up in tight infantry formations. The men in the front row would throw their Chakrams straight forward. But the men in the second and third rows wouldn't be able to do that, or they'd hit their own friends and soldiers. So instead, the second and third ranks would use a vertical overhead launch, and massive 2-foot wide chakrams would be thrown almost straight up into the air. The blades would arc high over the battlefield, completely bypassing the enemy's shield wall, and rain down vertically onto the enemy's heads and shoulders, wreaking havoc amongst the enemy's defenses and morale. But this maneuver required terrifying precision, because if the Nihang warrior in the third rank messed up his release by even a fraction of a second, he was dropping 2 pounds of spinning, razor sharp steel directly onto the skulls of his own friends. And one example of when the Chakram was actually used to change the tide of battle was in 1818, when the Sikh Empire was trying to capture the heavily fortified city of Multan. The fortress was heavily defended and the Sikh army was bogged down by enemy fire and cannon shots. But the Akali Nihang warriors were always prepared for such an event, as they wore towering dark blue turbans that were literally stacked with half a dozen chakrams of various sizes. And the metal rings actually acted like a defensive helmet, as they would absorb sword blows to the head, but also give them easy access to the missile weapons whenever they were needed. And without waiting for orders from the commanding officers, the suicide squad of Nihang shock troopers charged towards the fortress walls. There, the defenders on the walls braced themselves for an oncoming melee attack, and they raised their shields waiting for the Nihangs to climb over the walls. But before the Nihangs had even reached the walls, they unleashed a massive, synchronized volley of spinning steel chakrams, and the air was instantly filled with a screaming halo of flying blades. And as the chakrams pierced through enemies' bones, the defenders found their shields and armor to be ineffective. And that is because even if a chakram hit a metal helmet or armor, it didn't just stop. The gyroscopic momentum caused the blade to ricochet violently down into the packed defenders, acting like a pinball made of razor blades. Limbs were severed, muskets were chopped cleanly in half, and the defenders were thrown into absolute blind panic. They couldn't fight an enemy that was dismembering them from 40 yards away and cutting through their defenses without any issue. The Nihangs breached the walls almost instantly, plunging the fortress into chaos and forcing the rest of the Sikh army to rush in and secure the victory for the Sikh Empire. And you could be forgiven for thinking that this weapon is a relic of the past, but you would be heavily mistaken, as according to official records from the Oxford Pitt Rivers Museum, Sikh regiments were still actively deploying the Chakram in combat during World War II. So I hope you found this video on the history and usage of the Chakram to be interesting, and if you did enjoy it, please do like and share this video with others. And if you haven't done so already, subscribe to my channel, Lethal History, so you can find out more about wars, warriors, and weapons from Indian history. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day. Bye.